Part 2. End of the Cold War and Globalization. The final decade of the 20th century has witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, which led the world into a unipolar world. Every country has to model their economic policies after the US and Europe. The World Trade Organization emerged as a successor to GATT, and every country needed to lift the iron curtains and open the borders for global trade, a free flow of goods and services. By this globalization, the US and Europe saw a tremendous market all across the world, as they were amazed by seeing the cheap and available labor on the other side of the globe. When the economic strength and the flow of wealth increased in their hands, manufacturing started flying out to Asian countries due to the cheap labor force. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, though the World Trade Organization emerged as a successor to GATT in 1994 with 123 member nations, China only became a member into the WTO in December 2001. This is due to the lengthy procedure of negotiation required to make the changes in Communist China's economy to bring it on par with the world economic standards. Now there are 164 member countries and 24 observer governments in the WTO. Let's discuss some numbers. From the very beginning of the 20th century, the United States stayed on top of the global GDP with currently around $22 trillion. The European countries were mainly ranking between 2 to 10 in these years until Japan became the second highest with around 5 trillion GDP in 1980. After the Second World War, through the collapse of communist countries, China fell heavily in the GDP ranking. It improved its position from the 1990s onwards, and in 2010, it overtook Japan as the world's second largest economy. Currently, while the US stays on top in GDP ranking with approximately $22 trillion, China stands second with around $15 trillion and Japan with $5 trillion. The remaining 17 countries in G20 nations, from Germany to France to India, UK, Italy, up to Indonesia, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, have GDP ranging from 3 trillion to below 1 trillion. Say an average of $2 to $3 trillion. Now let's once again look at the GDP share of the leading countries in the world. United States has 22 trillion. China has 15 trillion. Japan has 5 trillion. The next 12 countries average 2 trillion. Note the difference between United States 22 trillion versus 2 trillion average of the G20 member nations, aside from China and Japan. The point I'm trying to hammer home here is the overwhelming economic power of the United States. On a GDP ranking, The USA has roughly 24% of the world's economy. China has 16%, whereas three countries ranking from 3 to 5 together have 12%. The next 5 countries ranks from 6 to 10 have 12%, and the following 10 countries from 11 to 20 have another 12%. The remaining 173 countries in the world, beside the top G20 nations together, have only 24%, which is less than 1/4 of the global economy. So the point is that the top 20 countries have more than 3/4 of the global GDP, and the top 10 countries, excluding China, controls over half of the world's economy. Let's talk about China. In 1990, China, with a $400 billion GDP, climbed from the 11th world ranking to the 6th in the year 2000 with a 1.2 trillion GDP, and secured number 2 in 2010 with its $6 trillion GDP, improved its strength to 15 trillion in 2019. This unprecedented growth has raised many eyebrows. The economies of cheap labor alone cannot be the reason for such growth. Currency manipulation, intellectual property theft, unethical business practices, etc., are some of the major allegations raised against China in the past few years. Though the Communist Party of China and its government ignored such allegations and continued their race to become the top economy in the world, it seemed achievable until United States US presidential election in 2016. Next, we will talk about the current economy and the effects of COVID-19.